Hello everyone. In this tutorial, I want to talk about how to organize nodes using containers. So far, we have been manually manipulating where our nodes go in our scenes. So for example, let me just quickly add a button to our scene and move it around. And so I'm kind of manually moving it around, and that can be cumbersome if I have multiple buttons that I want to have lined up and sized properly. Well, containers in Godot make it a lot easier to manage and line up and align various visual nodes that you might be using. So let's take a look at those. First, let me delete this. And take a look at body here. It's just this white rectangle. And so what I'm going to do is add a child node. And what I'm going to do is search for container. And you can see here under controls, Godot comes with a lot of different containers. But what we're interested right now is these box containers. So you can see here, there's a horizontal box container and a vertical box container. Let's start with a horizontal box container, and I'm just going to say create, and there it is right there. Now, these containers are not visual. So if I was to run my program, there's nothing there to see because they're really there to help us lay out all of its child nodes. And we'll take a look at that in a minute. Now, what I can do is click on layout here, and I can snap this HBox container to the position I want. So I'm going to choose top wide here because I want it to take up the full width of body up at the top. Now, what I can do is actually add some children to this. And so let's do something visual. Let's work with a button. Now, this button is a child of the HBox container. So what can I do with that? Well, first, let me add a little bit of text. So my button says press me. Now, what can I do with this? Well, over in the inspector panel, I can come to size flags. And what I can do is these size flags tell the parent, the horizontal box container, what to do with it. And so, for example, I might want to click expand. And what that is doing is telling the HBox container that this button should expand to fill the HBox container. Let me deselect that for a minute. Now, another thing we might want to do is come up to the top, select HBox container, and say we don't want our alignment of our child nodes of this container to be to the left. We want it to be in the center. And boom, it centers our button for us. We don't have to fool around with the X and Y position. Okay, so that's pretty neat, not that big of a deal. But what if we want to add another button? So let me duplicate this, and look what it does. It's perfectly lining those up for me so that I can keep them nice and centered. Now, let's come back to our size flags and tell Godot I want to expand this. So if I just expand one of the child buttons, look what happens. It expands as much as possible, keeping that second button at its minimum width. Alternatively, what I can do is for button 2, I could also adjust its size flags, its horizontal size flags. So I could click expand. Now check it out. If I was to run this, I've got two perfectly sized buttons that are the same size. Let's take it one step further and add a third button. And look at that. I have three equally sized, perfectly spaced buttons. Very, very handy feature. Now, what if I wanted to change the spacing between these three buttons? Easy to do. Make sure you select your HBox container and click on separation. I could actually set the separation to 0, or I can put in whatever value I want. Let's say I want a lot of space between these, like 40 pixels. I can just type in 40 there and boom. Or I might put in 100 and it looks really nice like that. The default, I think, is on the order of 6 pixels, something like that. Now, another thing we can do is we can actually expand our HBox container to take up the whole screen. So let me, with HBox container selected, let me come to my layout menu. I'm telling it to take up the full rectangle of the HBox container. So look at that. Everything just expanded. Now, if I don't want these really tall buttons, what I can do is select each button and tell it I don't want it to fill what I want it to do is actually shrink to the center. And notice I'm adjusting the vertical size flag now. I want it to come to the center. So for each one of these, I don't want it to fill, I want it to expand to the center. And boom, I've got 3 perfectly spaced, centered vertically now buttons. Very nice. Now, importantly, I'm showing you the horizontal box container, but we can do the same thing with a vertical box container. But instead of doing things horizontally, we're stacking things vertically. Another important point that I want to make is that you can combine containers. So let me come to body, and what I'm going to do is actually add a vertical box container. And I'm just going to move this up to the top just to show you. And then what I'm going to do is duplicate my HBox container. And what I'm going to do is add these as children of the vertical box. And take a look at what's going to happen. Now, with my vertical box container selected, I can tell it what I want to do. So I'm going to I want to move everything to the center. And then I need to tell this box to take up the full space like this. And now I have 2 rows of buttons. And of course, I could vary how these buttons behave in here. So I might not want to shrink to the center anymore. I actually might want them to fill and expand. And let me do this across the board, fill and expand. And now let's tell these HBox containers. Remember, we have to tell vertically we want these to expand. And now I have 6 perfectly spaced buttons in 2 rows that are expanding both horizontally and vertically. And of course I could adjust, let's say I wanted more separation between these, I could put in 200 pixels of separation. And that, my friends, is how you organize nodes using containers in Godot.